Welcome back to the deep dive. Now, today we're going to be diving into the life of a pretty fascinating historical figure, Mary Todd Lincoln.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Her story is one that I think a lot of people, well, I think most people know her as the wife of President Lincoln, but there's so much more to her than that.
Yeah, for sure. So, for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at excerpts from an episode of American History Tellers. And yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what we find.
Absolutely. Always fascinating to get into these kind of primary sources.
Right. So, to kind of set the stage, Mary Todd Lincoln, she was born in Kentucky, right?
Yeah, that's right, Kentucky.
Uh,
In 1818.
1818. Okay, so that puts her right in the heart of, well, antebellum America.
Yeah, exactly. And, you think of Kentucky, maybe you think of like plantations and wealth and privilege, right? But her early life, I mean, it wasn't exactly the picture of idyllic Southern comfort.
Really? So what was it like then?
Well, like when she was pretty young, like 6 years old, her mother passed away. Yeah, and she later described herself as feeling desolate after that happened. And she also had a strained relationship with her stepmother. Kind of had to navigate all the challenges that come with a blended family.
Oh, I see. So it sounds like there was some real hardship there.
Definitely. But despite all of that, she actually got a really good education. Her father, unlike a lot of fathers back then, he really believed in educating his daughters. And Mary, she thrived in her studies.
Okay, that's really interesting, especially for that time period. Not a lot of women had those kind of opportunities.
Right, exactly. And it really shows you, like from early on, she kind of had this drive, this intellectual curiosity.
It seems like she had this ambition almost. Like there's this famous story, I think it was even when she was a teenager, she declared that she would be Mrs. President one day.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's almost like she was, I don't know, almost like she was kind of predicting her own future.
Right. And, fast forward a few years and she meets this up and coming lawyer named Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because on paper, they were a pretty unlikely pair.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, she comes from this wealthy, well-connected family, and he's from much humbler beginnings.
Exactly. And, he had this kind of quiet, reserved personality, not really the typical society match that you'd expect for someone like Mary.
So what was it about him that she saw?
Well, I think she saw his potential. She recognized his ambition, his intellect. They shared a lot of interests, especially when it came to politics. And, their courtship was, by all accounts, very passionate, but also very tumultuous.
I've heard that. Like they had their fair share of disagreements, even separated for a brief time.
Yeah, but in the end, their connection was just undeniable. They ended up getting married in 1842.
And I think a lot of people don't realize, but Mary played a huge role in shaping Abraham's political career.
Oh, absolutely. She was his confidant, his advisor. She really believed in him and pushed him to pursue his ambitions.
Yeah. It's like she was, I don't know, kind of like the driving force behind him, helping him to become the man who would eventually lead the nation.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it's really fascinating to see how her own ambition kind of evolved as Abraham's political career took off.
So when he's elected president in 1861, this is kind of like this is Mary's moment,
It
right?
is. It's her time to step onto the national stage and become that Mrs. President she'd always envisioned.
And she does not hold back.
No, not at all. She completely embraces the role of First Lady and really kind of throws herself into it.
I mean, this was a big departure from the first ladies who came before her, right? Like they were much more reserved, more behind the
Oh,
scenes.
yeah, completely different. Mary saw the role as an opportunity to make a real impact, to shape policy, to be a force for social change. And she wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers along the way.
That's right. I mean, she famously spent lavishly on White House renovations, on her wardrobe, and she threw these huge parties, these kind of legendary gatherings.
Yeah, and that drew a lot of criticism, especially since the country was in the middle of a civil war.
Yeah, like some people saw it as frivolous, insensitive. But, I think it's also important to consider the context of the time.
Oh, absolutely. The role of the First Lady was changing. And Mary, in a lot of ways, she was trying to redefine it.
I see. So she was trying to kind of balance tradition with this new vision of a more modern, more active first lady.
Exactly. And it was that clash of expectations that created a lot of the controversy that surrounded her.
Right. But, she also used these parties, these gatherings, as a way to network, to
Mhm.
influence political appointments. She was really strategic about it.
Oh, for sure. She was very savvy. And these events weren't just social gatherings, they were opportunities for her to gather information, to build relationships, to advocate for causes she believed in.
And remember, this was a time when women's voices were often silenced. So she was really pushing boundaries.
Absolutely. She was a force to be reckoned with. But, even as she was navigating this political landscape, she was also dealing with a lot of personal challenges.
Yeah, like in 1862, her son, Willie, he died from typhoid fever. And this was just a devastating loss for her.
Yeah, absolutely tragic. And, she was criticized for the way she grieved. Some people thought she was being too emotional, too dramatic.
Again, that kind of speaks to those societal expectations of the time, right? Like
Yeah.
how women were supposed to behave.
Exactly. And it's around this time that she starts to find comfort in spiritualism.
Okay, now spiritualism, that was a pretty big movement in the 19th century, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It gained a lot of traction, especially during times of war and widespread grief.
So what was it about spiritualism that appealed to Mary, do you think?
Well, I think for her, it was a way to cope with the loss of her son, to feel connected to him again.
It was a way to find some peace, some solace in a really difficult time.
Exactly. But, her involvement with spiritualism also opened her up to more criticism and ridicule.
Of course. I mean, it was seen as unconventional, even taboo by some.
Yeah, definitely. And, we'll get into this more in the next part of our deep dive, but that kind of sets the stage for how Mary's life would unfold even after the Civil War.
Okay, so make sure to join us for part 2 of our deep dive into the life of Mary Todd Lincoln.
Yeah, we'll uncover more of the story next time.
So last time we were talking about Mary Todd Lincoln finding some comfort in spiritualism after the death of her son.
Right, and it's really interesting how that played out for her, because on the one hand, she really did seem to find some peace through it.
Yeah, like the idea that she could still connect with Willie, must have been a huge source of comfort for her during such a dark time.
Absolutely. I mean, especially when you consider, how much grief she was carrying
Mm-hmm.
and the pressures of being first lady, the war raging on, it all just kind of added up.
Right, and all of that happening so publicly, too. It couldn't have been easy.
No, not at all. But then at the same time, spiritualism also became this lightning rod for criticism.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't exactly mainstream thinking back then.
No, definitely not. It was viewed as kind of out there, maybe even a little dangerous by some.
So it's kind of like this double-edged sword for her, right? Like
Mhm.
trying to find solace, but also facing even more judgment for it.
Exactly. And, this kind of becomes a theme for Mary. She just couldn't seem to escape scrutiny no matter what she did.
Yeah, it's like every decision she made, every action she took, it was always under this microscope.
And don't forget, this is all happening against the backdrop of the Civil War, a war that's tearing the country apart.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine the pressure she must have felt. Her husband's leading the nation through this incredibly tumultuous time, and she's trying to navigate her own personal struggles.
Yeah, it must have been incredibly isolating.
And their marriage, I mean, it had to have been strained under all of that, right?
Oh, definitely. Abraham was so consumed with the war effort, he often withdrew into himself. And that left Mary feeling, well, neglected.
It's heartbreaking in a way. They clearly loved each other, but the circumstances were just so difficult.
Yeah, I mean, imagine needing your partner's support more than ever, and they're just not able to be there for you in the way that you need them to be.
Right. And she was criticized for her spending, especially during the war.
Yeah, and that's something that really started to spiral in the later war years. Maybe it was a way of coping with the stress and loneliness, but it definitely didn't help her public image.
It's like she was stuck in this no-win situation.
Hmm.
If she spends, she's extravagant. If she withdraws, she's criticized for not being present.
Exactly. There was no right answer for her, it seemed like.
And then, just as the war is ending, Lincoln is assassinated.
Yeah, April 1865, just days after the Confederacy surrendered.
What a blow. I mean, can you imagine the grief after everything she'd been through to lose her husband like that?
It was devastating. She blamed herself, thought maybe if she hadn't pushed him so hard in his political career, maybe things would have been different.
Oh, wow. The guilt on top of the grief, it's almost unimaginable.
And she loses her status. Her whole world as she knew it changes overnight.
And those debts she'd racked up from all the spending, those start to come due.
Oh, yeah. Suddenly she's facing financial ruin. She has to sell her possessions, even some of Abraham's belongings, just to try and make ends meet.
It's hard to believe, from First Lady to facing that kind of hardship. And the press, of course, they didn't let up.
No, they had a field day, painting her as unstable, irresponsible, even questioning her sanity.
It's like they were looking for someone to blame for all the uncertainty and chaos of the post-war era.
And Mary, she became an easy target.
So where did she go from there? How did she cope with all of that?
Well, things took a really dark turn for her. She became increasingly isolated. Her grief manifested in these, well, unconventional ways.
And it was ultimately her son, Robert, who had her committed to an asylum, right?
Yeah, in 1875.
It's tough to imagine what would lead a son to commit his own mother, especially a former first lady, to an asylum.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta wonder what was going through Robert's head at the time.
I mean, on one hand, you can see where he's coming from, right? If he truly believed she was a danger to herself or others.
Right. And remember, mental illness was not well understood back then.
Oh, yeah, totally different time. But it still just feels so, I don't know, so extreme.
It definitely raises questions, yeah. Like, was she truly mentally ill, or was it just, grief and the stress of everything she'd been through?
I mean, think about it. Losing 3 of her children, her husband, facing financial ruin, the constant public attacks.
Right. Any one of those things would be incredibly difficult to deal with, and she was facing all of them at once.
It's almost as if she was being punished for, I don't know, for not fitting into society's expectations of how a woman, especially a former first lady, should behave.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that. She was always pushing those boundaries, challenging those norms, and it seems like in the end, it backfired.
So what happened when she was committed? Was that it for her?
Thankfully, no. She was only there for about 3 months. She actually managed to smuggle a letter out to a friend. Yeah, and that friend helped her get a lawyer and fight for her release.
I mean, talk about resilience.
Right. And a year later, another jury declared her sane, and she was free.
So she had to fight to reclaim her own sanity, to prove to the world that she was, well, that she was in control of her own life.
Exactly, and she won that fight. But that experience, it definitely left its mark on her.
I bet. So what were her final years like? Did she ever find any peace?
Well, she spent some time in Europe, kind of getting away from all the scrutiny and judgment in America, and eventually she came back to the States, lived with her sister in Springfield, Illinois.
Back in Springfield, where it all began.
Right, full circle in a way. It's kind of poignant when you think about it.
So looking back at her whole life, what would you say is Mary Todd Lincoln's legacy?
It's complicated, that's for sure. I mean, she was this incredibly intelligent, ambitious woman. She loved fiercely, and she faced incredible challenges with a lot of strength.
Which is also flawed, right?
Yeah, of course we all are. And, she made mistakes, she made choices that people questioned. But I think the important thing is to remember that she was a product of her time, a time when women were expected to be seen and not heard.
And she refused to be silenced.
Exactly. And that's what makes her story so compelling, so relevant even today. She reminds us that it's okay to challenge the status quo, to fight for what you believe in, even when it's hard.
And to never underestimate the strength and resilience of women.
Well said. It's been great exploring her life with you.
Likewise. And to all our listeners out there, if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you subscribe to the deep dive so you don't miss out on our next fascinating exploration.